Neglect shapes the mind in silence. You rarely realize it until you're already broken. What happens when your pain doesn't come from what was done to you, but from what was missing? No yelling, no bruises, no cruelty, just silence, disconnection, emotional absence, moments that should have mattered but didn't. Many carry a strange, quiet guilt, believing their problems stem from some personal flaw. They're anxious, overly responsible, deeply self-critical. But what if these traits are not flaws? What if they are adaptations born in childhood from being consistently unseen? This isn't about blame. It's about understanding the long shadow that emotional neglect casts. It's about facing a truth most people can't name. Being ignored isn't painless. It's invisible, emotional starvation. And the cost isn't just in memories. It's embedded in your relationships, your nervous system, and how you see yourself. If you've ever felt unworthy, empty, or chronically disconnected, this story might be yours too. It didn't look like abuse, but it was wounding. Most people think neglect means being beaten or abandoned, but sometimes it's just being constantly overlooked. Emotional neglect wears no obvious face. It doesn't yell, it doesn't rage, it quietly turns away. The ignored child isn't necessarily unloved. More often, they're simply unacknowledged. A parent is present, but emotionally unavailable. There's food, there's shelter, there's even laughter, but no one asks, "What are you feeling?" Over years, this absence compounds. The child begins to internalize the silence. Psychologically, it leaves no visible bruise, but instead it fractures two essential functions. One, the development of emotional regulation, and two, the construction of self-worth. We underestimate acknowledgement. To feel secure, a child needs more than necessities. They need to matter emotionally. That's how identity takes root. Otherwise, the child becomes emotionally self-sufficient too early and mistaken for being independent or low maintenance. In reality, they're adapting to being emotionally alone. You learn to shrink because it worked. You weren't loud, you weren't difficult, you were easy to ignore, and that's exactly why you were. You learned early that needing attention didn't get you more love. It got you distance, discomfort, or silence. So you did what worked. You stopped needing. You turned down your emotions. You stopped sharing victories, stopped asking questions. You lived in a house where joy, pain, or curiosity had nowhere to go, so you carried them alone. This adaptation wasn't born from weakness. It was a strategy, a highly intelligent, unconscious, necessary one. Children don't simply survive hardship by enduring it. They survive by changing themselves to fit it. Emotionally neglected children become masters at shrinking themselves. They make space for everyone else's needs while training themselves not to express their own. And when this becomes your baseline, adulthood feels like this. You listen deeply but struggle to speak. You give endlessly but can't ask for anything. You disappear just enough to be tolerated, but never fully seen.
Not seen, not reflected, not real. Without feedback and emotional reflection, the child begins to disappear, not physically, but psychologically. The self is relational. Identity doesn't just develop inside you, it's mirrored through others, through facial expressions, emotional responses, feedback. When a child's joys, fears, or opinions are consistently unacknowledged, they don't just feel unimportant, they feel unreal. This isn't poetic, it's psychological. Without emotional reflection, a child loses clarity around who they are. They trade authenticity for acceptability. They act how they're expected to act, feel what they're allowed to feel. And over time, they lose access to their inner world. As adults, this shows up in vague self-doubt. I don't know what I want. A fear of confrontation. I'd rather disappear than be a burden. And emotional numbness. I feel disconnected, even from myself. This isn't dramatic, it's dissociation, mild or deep, a coping mechanism in response to not having been mirrored enough as a child to know who you were allowed to be. The nervous system learned to expect rejection. Neglect doesn't just shape personality, it wires your stress response. Emotional neglect gets under the skin. It alters the nervous system over time. When consistent love or attention is absent, the brain interprets this as a threat. Cortisol, our primary stress hormone, surges. The child becomes hyper-alert to danger, waiting for rejection before it happens. This state of vigilance becomes their baseline. As adults, they might panic when someone doesn't immediately reply, or shrink under mild criticism, or feel emotionally flooded by small disagreements, not because they're too sensitive, but because their nervous system still believes it's unsafe to be seen. This isn't weak, it's trauma-informed conditioning. Add to this the lessons, don't ask, don't bother anyone, take care of yourself. And the result? A person who looks calm outside, but lives in permanent readiness for disappointment. Understanding this isn't an excuse, it's a mirror. It explains why emotional closeness triggers threat responses, why safety feels foreign, why quiet feels like danger rather than peace. You became the peacemaker, the overachiever, the ghost. Ignored children don't disappear. They adapt into roles, perfect, silent, or endlessly giving. To survive, the ignored child often finds an identity that delivers just enough validation to avoid the sting of their invisibility. Some become overachievers, their excellence a way to be noticed without asking. Praise becomes the substitute for presence. Others become peacemakers, calm, agreeable, endlessly accommodating. Conflict feels dangerous. Assertiveness feels selfish. Some become ghosts, so used to being overlooked that they stop reaching out altogether. They fade into jobs, rooms, and relationships. Others become caretakers, turning their attunement to others into a self-worth system, always helping, never helped. Each of these roles works. They gain surface approval, but beneath them is someone terrified of being unmasked, terrified there's no value to who they are beneath the role. These roles aren't faults, they were necessities, but they're exhausting, and they never fill the original void.
The cost shows up later, and quietly. You succeed at work, but can feel proud. You're surrounded, but feel alone. You're loved, but doubt it constantly. The pain of emotional neglect often doesn't show all at once. It lingers quietly in contradictions. You laugh, but don't feel joy. You connect, but don't feel safe. You achieve, but don't feel fulfilled. You become emotionally fluent for everyone, but mute for yourself. This is how the cost of neglect reveals itself years later in chronic patterns. Shrinking your voice, apologizing for being seen, downplaying your needs, distrusting affection. Because deep inside, a lie still lives. If I matter, why wasn't I seen then? And that disconnect doesn't go away by achieving more. It only begins to shift when you acknowledge that what you lacked mattered. Healing starts with recognition, not perfection. You don't need to fix everything. You need to start seeing what went unseen. Healing from emotional neglect doesn't begin with action. It begins with recognition, saying the sentence that was never said. This happened to me, and it mattered. You don't need to confront anyone first, or have the perfect words. You just need to stop minimizing your past and start honoring your need for connection. Emotional neglect thrives in silence. Healing begins when that silence is broken. Not dramatically, but softly. It might start with writing down how the absence made you feel.
with telling a friend something real, with noticing your emotions before erasing them. Small acts of visibility to yourself again and again. That's the repair. That's how you begin to tell your nervous system you're allowed to be here now, and you don't have to disappear to be safe. You were never meant to stay invisible. You adapted to invisibility, but now you're allowed to be seen, even by yourself. You were never broken. You were shaped. You adapted to a world that didn't know how to see you. You muted your light, not because it was too bright, but because no one looked long enough to reflect it. But now you can begin to see what others missed. You can start becoming visible, to yourself first. You can build safety internally before waiting for someone else to mirror it. No child should have to become emotionally self-sufficient, but every adult can choose to reclaim what was lost. And even though healing takes time, the shift begins the moment you stop treating your emotional needs as inconveniences. You matter. Your needs matter. Your presence matters. And no, you were never truly invisible. You were shaping resilience in silence. Now you're allowed to step into visibility, not to prove anything, but because you're finally ready to be seen.